Next topic we're going to start looking at is radiography, and we're going to primarily focus on the use of X-ray and gamma ray radiation. There are other forms of radiography, such as neutron radiography, but these are the two most common used in aerospace, although you're seeing probably neutron a little bit more. Neutron radiography is very similar to gamma in terms of how it's performed. So this is now we're getting into the first of our topics that don't have labs to go along with them. So these we're purely looking at the process from the theoretical standpoint. I'll talk through the process, but we're not going to perform it down in the lab necessarily. So radiography is we are working with electromagnetic radiation that is of a very short wavelength, or it's at also can be a high frequency. Remember, wavelength and frequency are inverse of each other. So this is very high frequency, short wavelength radiation. And what happens is as these either particles or waves travel through a materials of different properties, different densities, different absorption properties, that kind of thing, are going to affect, they're going to let more or less of this radiation through. And so those properties can be, the one that's probably most common, most people are aware of or have had done at some point or another in their life is, you've had x-rays done on either bones, joints, or for dental work, and things like soft tissue like skin and those kind of things, skin, fat, muscle, the radiation passes through fairly easily. Whereas your more dense objects, especially those that contain calcium, like bones and teeth, those block radiation. So you can image those different, body parts using this. Well, we can also apply that to aircraft parts, or in an industrial setting, or civil engineering, like a bridge inspection or something like that. And so the gist of it is that the denser materials absorb more of the radiation. They don't let it pass through. And thicker materials, so less dense materials are going to allow more radiation to pass through in a given area. Thicker materials are going to absorb more radiation than thinner. So a given, if you have a given material and you have a thicker area and a thinner area, that's going to affect how much radiation passes through. And that is what it is. Radiography has to be, it's a pass-through technique. You have to have a transmission on one side of the object and then some kind of a detection mechanism on the other side of the object. So just looking back at we've been kind of bouncing around the electromagnetic spectrum up to this point. We've talked about sound waves, which aren't even shown here, but those are off to the left. And then we've looked at radio, kind of microwave, infrared, right? We've looked at visible light, right? We've talked about UV, ultraviolet, when we're doing mag particle or liquid penetrant. And now we're starting to get into this high frequency, short wavelength area, high energy. You can also see the energy content of a single particle or photon here is significantly higher up in this X-ray and gamma ray range on the right side of the chart. So we're going to be looking in this range right here. Wavelengths, just to give it 10 to the negative third is millimeters. Let me think. Millimeter, micrometer. So these are a million times shorter than a micrometer. Very, very tiny wavelength. Okay. So radiography has some distinct advantages. It can provide a lot of detail because the waves are so small. It can provide very high detail. Okay. And then it also is dependent on your detector. And we'll look at different kinds of detectors. Older detectors were film. If anyone's worked with film, they've dealt with things like grain size. Or newer detectors being digital, as technology improves, our resolution, like the arrays we talked about on the thermal cameras, or like the resolution you see on a television or a standard visible camera, right? These detectors, these digital detectors have gotten higher and higher resolution over the years as well. It's primarily used for finding internal flaws that you can't detect on the surface or in parts that are hidden behind other parts. The main places I've seen this used on aircraft is we had wing spar inspection. We would have to have the wing spars x-rayed so you can check the condition of the wing spar without having to remove the skin of the wing. Also where it passes through, where the carry through is, where it goes through the under part of the fuselage. And then also in that, where the wing spar, where the landing gear, the trunnion area, where essentially the main gear tie into the wing spars, we would have x-rays done of those landing main gear trunnions to make sure that you don't have any cracks forming due to that repeated, every time the plane lands, you're basically slamming the gear into the trunnions, which is slamming into the internals of the wing spar. And so because of this high, this high resolution and it's internal, we can detect significant variations, things like cracks or even differences in metal caused by deformation. And then in the past, this was one of the techniques that offered a permanent record because we had film. Today, typically instead of film, we would use a digital detector, and then those files that are produced by it can be saved. So, if you have proper storage and backup and everything else, I guess in theory it could last forever. You just have to make sure that the files are stored properly. There are, however, some distinct and fairly sizable disadvantages when working with radiography, with X-ray and gamma ray. And most people are probably aware of this first one, is that radiation is hazardous. And to add to that, not only is it hazardous, it can cause health hazards, but our bodies do not have, human bodies do not have the ability to detect radiation like this. So we don't know if we're in the presence of X-ray or gamma radiation. And it can cause damage to the cells of our bodies, and we won't know it until after the damage has been done. Radiation sickness doesn't typically occur right away. It's a delayed effect. Okay, you can get burns from it, but same thing. By the time you're getting a radiation burn, you're probably also causing other internal damage that you can't see. So there's significant handling and tracking procedures that have to take place. Any kind of radioactive material, which is what we use for gamma ray and neutron radiography, there are reporting and tracking requirements in the US with the, with the Nuclear Regulatory, NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so there's special tracking that goes along with that. Even like, here in a university setting, when I've looked at, can we do radiography as part of NDT, the university, because they use radiation in different areas, has an office just dedicated to handling this kind of thing. So the university as a whole has essentially a nuclear materials management person whose sole job is to track every type of radiation source at the university and then make sure that is properly reported to the NRC. So there's an expense there, and there's regulations that you have to comply with that are more stringent and require extra work and extra training beyond what would be needed for a lot of these other techniques we've been doing. So compliance is costly, time consuming. Like I said, there's a person whose sole job it is to deal with this at the university, right? That's a full-time job, just making sure we're in compliance. So, at a university, okay, that makes sense. If you're in a small company, it may be part of your job, but at the end of the day, it can be a big burden. So you may not be able to, it may not make sense for a company to do something like this in-house. In fact, none of the airlines I worked for had, if we had to do any kind of X-ray or gamma ray, they contracted it out. to a company or an inspection company that pretty much only did X-ray. They'd travel around the country with portable X-ray equipment doing that. Or if parts had to be X-rayed, they would be sent to a repair station or an overhaul shop that did X-ray regularly as part of their processes. The other part is you've got to have a certain level of contrast in the materials, whether that be the density of the materials, how well they absorb or don't absorb the radiation, how thick or thin the materials are. If you have a material that is very that doesn't have that contrast in there, it's going to be very hard to image it using X-ray, right? So you have to have enough contrast in how the materials react or allow the passage of radiation in order to be able to image properly. So here's kind of an example, one part that's been X-rayed two different ways. Okay, or it's had radiography. I assume it's X-ray. It could have been gamma ray, I guess. But the energy, affects this part. So here you have a low energy. So what happens with the film, by the way, X-ray film, the way it always worked, is the film starts out white and it turns black in the areas exposed to X-ray or exposed to the radiation. Okay? So that's why on your X-rays you've had for dental work or bones, right? The bones and the teeth show up white, and then the areas where you have tissue are kind of gray, and the areas outside of that are black. It's the same thing happening here. So this part, its thickest, heaviest duty areas are in the end caps here. Can anyone kind of tell what that is by looking at it? Does anything stand out to you? What? It's an accumulator. You got your kind of the pipe that holds it, the end caps. There's the dividing piston in the middle. Okay, it's an accumulator type device. Okay, but so you have a heavy duty cap on each end. You can see that's blocking the majority of the radiation, right? You have some radiation making it through, and you're able to image this. You can see the dividing plate in the middle. You can kind of see the pipe if it were, the body, if it were to have any cracks in it or anything like that. Now, at the same time, you've got some parts that are part of the end caps that you can't see in the low energy image. And so here is a high energy, either the radiation source was exposed for a longer period of time, or it was the power output was increased. If this was an X-ray, you can adjust how much power is being put out in a given amount of time. If it's gamma ray, you can move the gamma ray source, the material, closer to the object. So, some more of the radiation's hitting the object for a given period of time. But now you can see we can image the end caps a little bit. So there's you have to be aware of what power settings you need, how long do you expose it for, but you can use essentially the same setup to get two different images to kind of inspect different parts of the test object. So again, as I alluded to at the beginning, we have two primary types of radiation sources used in NDT. The first one being radioisotopes, which typically emit in the gamma range. Now there is neutron radiography as well, so there are some radiation sources now that emit in the neutron range, that emit neutrons rather than gamma waves. Most common, some common ones we'll look at some more, but iridium-192 is often used in aviation. The other version is X-ray. These are man-made. So the big difference here is a radioisotope is radioactive, and it's going to be radioactive. And you can't shut it off. All you can do is contain it. You have to have some kind of a safe container to put it in. Versus an X-ray it's electrically generated. So it's a source that can be turned on and off. So X-ray typically is considered safer in general just because it is, it can be controlled as long as you take the proper precautions and Make sure you don't turn the machine on when you have your hand inside of it, which most of them have like a door with a lockout. It won't turn on if the door's open, kind of like your microwave, right? But at the same time, X-ray tends to not be very portable. These tend to be large. They require a lot of power. So usually they aren't just something you can go plug in the wall somewhere. They have to be wired into a high power circuit. To give you a little bit more view of what's going on with radiation, I've got a quick video here. So when we're working with these materials, we have to monitor exposure. We don't want to, as I said earlier, we don't have a way, our bodies don't have a way of naturally sensing or detecting when we're in the presence of these types of radiation. Versus, infrared, just to give you an example, infrared we can feel as heat, right? Visible light, we can see visible light. Ultraviolet, we can't really see, but ultraviolet causes sunburn, but it's not gonna instantly cause you to become cancer riddled. I mean, sunburn over time will. But something like this, a single overexposure to radiation can significantly increase your chance of developing cancers, or it can actually cause radiation poisoning and kill you. And so we have to monitor this. What is too much? And the big things here is this is a function. You have to be aware it's a function of the intensity of the exposure and the time you're exposed, right? So a smaller amount of radiation over a longer period of time can be just as bad as a large dose of radiation in a short period of time. And so that has to be, you have to take that into account if you're going to be working around these materials and this equipment quite a bit. And we have ways of making, trying to keep it safe. What have you seen? How do you see, radiation safety in some of the scenarios you may have come in contact with? What are some of the things that you may have personally had to do? Because I know a lot of you have been around this stuff. What lead shielding in what regard? You wear the smock, the lead smock at the dentist, right? Because they're imaging your mouth rather, they don't want to get the rest of your body. Anything else? I have kids, I've had to take them for x-rays. They make me step out of the room. They have a room that has some kind of shielding, whether it's heavy concrete or lead. Okay. The radiation technicians step out of the room. They have a control room that's outside, or the dental hygienist or technician, typically steps away from or out of the room when they do that. That's a very, very low level, by the way, radiation. It's a very tiny. You get more radiation sometimes flying on an airplane than you do from your dentist. Okay. Anything else people have seen? Those are probably the most common. But if we're in an area where we know there's going to be exposure, if you're going to be working around this a lot, we need to monitor and keep track of this. Part of it is you want to do it for your own health. Part of it is there are regulations that surround that. So for instance, there are OSHA regulations surrounding exposure, limiting and what kind of tracking and what kind of record keeping has to be done. So the ways we do that is if you're in an area where, say you have a permanently set up facility, you might have an area monitor. Things like airborne contamination monitors. What are called personal exit monitors. Those are essentially you get scanned for radiation automatically as you enter or exit, particularly exit an area to make sure that there's no radioactive material, dust or whatever that's gotten on you. Interlocks, multiple doors you have to go through to prevent air exchange. Those are pretty extreme. Some of the more common ones, portable instruments, survey meters or Geiger counters, are often a lot more. And you'll see that you would use something like a Geiger counter or a survey meter if you were performing portable inspection. I've got a video that shows that. But what we do, to measure this, it's measured in what are called REMs. And a REM is a unit of radiation dosage as it applies to humans. So again, that can be based on small exposure, long period of time, short exposure, long period of time. And it's approximately 1 Roentgen, which is a unit of ionizing radiation, the amount producing 1 electrostatic unit of positive or negative ionic charge in 1 cubic centimeter of air under standard conditions. It was discovered by a German physicist, or it was named after the German physicist Wilhelm Conrad Roentgen, who was the discoverer of X-rays. But don't worry, you don't need to know that part of it, just that a rem is a unit of radiation dose. So you'll often see that. There were a couple of years ago, Chernobyl movies were all the rage, right? And shows. There's Chernobyl. What's that? Good show, yeah. And they talked about some of this stuff. So we have our 2 types, our radioisotopes. These are materials that are going to give off radiation. And that's what was just discussed in the video, where these have half-life. So just a few common ones out there. Some are naturally occurring like carbon-14. Who knows where the application of carbon-14? Ever heard of the use of carbon-14? No? Anyone gone to a museum and they tell you how old the dinosaur bones are? That's radiocarbon dating. They're looking at the decay of carbon-14. It has an extremely long half-life. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's long enough that that's how you can date, radiocarbon date items, objects, dinosaur bones and other stuff that are millions of years old. They can look at how much carbon-14, how many, it's a very low level radiation. It's all over in the environment. We're exposed to it all the time. But, on a specific object, based on how long it's been around, the carbon-14 level will go down over time. We have some that are artificially produced. The iridium-192 I talked about is an unstable isotope of iridium, and it doesn't exist in nature. So it has to be man-made in something like a particle accelerator or a cyclotron. So it's a combination of neutrons and protons in the atom that doesn't exist. You can have sources that are neutron-rich or proton-rich, too many neutrons or too many protons. And as they lose those particles, they lose those alpha and beta particles at the same time. That causes that wave, that gamma radiation, that gamma wave to be given off. Something like carbon-14 doesn't give off much gamma radiation. It loses, I can't remember if it's alpha or beta. I think it's alpha, but I could be mistaken. And it's going to give off a very tiny amount of gamma radiation, but it's so small that it's minimal. So you have to monitor, again, the exposure to this stuff to know, are you getting too much radiation? Here's some common sources for NDT, and just to give you an idea. So, here's that iridium-192. It has a half-life of 74 days. And here's penetrating power, inches of steel. So that can go through about 3 inches of steel. Okay. You can see something like cobalt can be used on heavier materials. And the reason these are important, these half-lives, is because you have to, if you're doing radioisotope inspection, you have to track how old your material is, how old your source material is. It doesn't mean you can't use a material after 74 days, like iridium-192 there. But what it means is it's going to only be giving off half the intensity of radiation that it was given off the day it was created. And so you have to keep in mind that you have to track when was the material created, or when was it new, when did it, and how much radiation is it currently giving off? Because you may have to adjust as a material goes through those half-lives, as it ages, as your gamma source ages, you may need to expose it to your test piece longer in order to get the same amount of radiation, the same amount of exposure on your film. Because over time, it's going to give off less and less radiation to a point where it no longer is useful or effective. And so you have to know when you reach that point and when you need to retire a piece of material and get something new. Other uses for this stuff, you can see radio tracer. That's what the lady in the video is talking about, where they can inject it into a person and see, you can find things like blocked arteries, right? You can see where it's not traveling or where it is traveling in the body, where you can find internal bleeding. Also gamma sterilization. So again, not really an aerospace thing, but I don't know how many of you have paid attention if you've had an outpatient surgery or anything like that. Have you ever seen like a pair of forceps or doctor's tools? They come in a bag and it's got a radiation symbol on it. Probably not. Maybe. Yeah. It doesn't mean the part inside there's radiation. It means it was gamma sterilized. It means they use radiation to sterilize it before they put it into that little baggie so that they can pull it out so it's clean when they go to use it to work on you. So the half-life is a statistical model. It's based on statistics. And so it's the length of time, essentially, after which there's a 50% chance that a specific atom within that lump of material has undergone nuclear decay. So after one half-life, half the atoms have released their extra neutrons or protons, whatever it might be, and half the atoms have not, right? And so then after a second half-life, that material that was the half that still had not released their particles, half of those have released the particles. So you saw the jelly bean thing. All radiation, the whole piece, lump of material is giving off, and each time it goes through a half-life, that intensity will be reduced by half. Okay? Will be cut in half. I'm going to go ahead and stop there.